eventually I forced myself to change my accent. I used to have a Kiwi accent. I sounded British a little bit, right? But in 5th grade, I was like, I made myself, everything I said, I wanted to sound super American. So for a while, I sounded awful, right? Like it was just a switch of accents. My mom's nodding her head. Like the teachers would look at me like, what are you saying? But I was trying to fit in, right? But then on the other hand, in my family life, we attended church. We went to a Presbyterian church, 长老教会, and in Presbyterian churches, we speak Taiwanese. I hated Taiwanese because everybody around me who spoke Taiwanese, I thought were old or they were blue-collar workers, right? Nobody our age spoke Taiwanese, so I didn't really want to learn it, right? Eventually, I did learn some Chinese. I attended our choir, so then I had to learn how to read, the lyrics to these songs. So I'm like, in 8th grade, still doing like "bupa mufa" on these characters. And then at the time, my parents also owned movie theaters, so I would watch movies and learn my Chinese reading through the subtitles. But the problem with that was I was listening in English and reading symbols, right? So even to this day, there are so many Chinese characters that I look at and I'm like, I know what this means, but I don't know how it's pronounced. For example, there was a movie, I always call it The Rock. It's not The Rock. It's about nuclear weapons. What's it called? Please help. Yeah. Alcatraz, okay? So they're talking about nuclear weapons all the time, and in Chinese, I can see the characters in my head right now, but I don't know what it's called. And then one day, a couple years ago, Taiwan was talking about the nuclear plants, right? Like they're against some nuclear plant or something. And then I would see these characters everywhere, and again, I'm like, I know what they're talking about, but I can't even say these characters out, right? So Max says that my Chinese is okay. It's really not okay. And then people would always ask, where are you from? Because they would look at me like you just looked at me and think, okay, this is a Taiwanese person, but why can't she speak the language, right? So it always kind of caught people off guard. And as a child, I would try to find an answer. So the easiest way that I could figure out was saying, okay, wherever I've lived the longest is where I'm from. So soon after we moved back from New Zealand, I'd been in Taiwan for 2 or 3 years. I'd be like, oh, I'm from New Zealand because I've lived there longer. But eventually I lived in Taiwan 7 years. So after that, then what? Do I say I'm Taiwanese? But I didn't live in a Taiwanese environment. Do I say I'm American? I've never really lived in America. So when people ask me, even now, and they say, where are you from? I cannot give an answer because there isn't a simple answer to give. And so I am what people would refer to as a banana. I am yellow on the outside and I'm white on the inside, right? And I have a lot of friends who are the opposite, they're eggs. Born, raised in Taiwan, speak better Chinese than me, went to Chinese school, but you look at them and they're white. And then eggs. Or Twinkie. No, Twinkies are us, right? Eggs.
White outside.
White outside, yellow on the inside. Yeah. But because of this, right, I would never order food. Like, imagine a 20-year-old going to McDonald's and still making my mom order food. Because I still can't read the characters, right? I'd be like, Mom, I want a cheeseburger, and she'd have to go and order the food for me, okay? But also, growing up, I was scared to get in a taxi. I never went to a night market. Max thinks this is funny. We grew up in Fengyuan and 有庙东夜市. I don't know if you guys know it. I've never been there. So we just didn't live in a very Taiwanese environment, right? So it wasn't until high school that my white friends took me to Fengjia 夜市 for the first time. Because before that, I just never went, right? And I was always afraid that I would have to get into a taxi and say, I want to go somewhere, and the taxi driver would be like, huh? Like, what are you talking about, right? So I was always kind of embarrassed, so I just kind of stopped doing anything unless somebody took me, even though I was in Taiwan and I am Taiwanese. But however, I would say for the adult world, my lack of Chinese ability was almost like enviable. Like my parents would take us out and we would speak Chinese and they'd be like, oh, 你的英文好棒哦. And I'd be like, yeah, but my Chinese is really not good. And they're like, oh, that's okay. It doesn't matter that you can't speak Chinese, as long as you can speak English, that's fine, right? They wanted their kids to be like us. So as a child, of course, you're like, well, why should I learn Chinese then, right? It doesn't matter. And then one last thing I want to talk about my life in Taiwan was before we went to America, our school, being an international school, they understood children like us. But we didn't understand it, right? Because this is just us. We didn't think it was anything special. So when we were writing our college applications, they were like, if you can speak more than one language, write it down. And I remember the counselor looking at us. And we're like, yeah, but we can't speak Chinese that well. She's like, it doesn't matter. Write it down. Because you can still speak Chinese better than the kids in America who only literally speak one language. So it kind of got us prepared for, okay, even though we're not great, it's still better than somebody else, right? And then the other thing was they told us, because as a TCK, a third culture kid, which is somebody who's grown up in an environment that is not your parents, because we're so used to people coming and going, right? A lot of business kids, Nike kids, whatever, they'll come for 2 years and then they leave. So our teachers told us, when you make friends in your life now, you guys go really deep. You guys talk about very personal things. But when you go to America, these kids have grown up with the same friends from elementary, middle school to high school. And maybe some of you have too, right? If you've only ever lived in Taiwan in the same house growing up. And they said, when you go to America, you're going to think these people are so surface. Like that you might think that they're not smart, you might not think that they're sincere, 很肤浅, right? Because they don't talk about anything worthwhile. But they're going to look at you and think, whoa, why are you asking me these questions? I don't know you, right? So they're just saying for you to get to know them, you feel like you have to ask all of these questions. But be aware that might not be the way they, the white kids in America, communicate. So then,